the name of Allah, the most gracious and most merciful, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon the Prophet Muhammad and his purified progeny, and may the damnation of Allah be upon their enemies. Dear brothers and sisters, 𝗧𝗨𝗥𝗓𝗦𝗧𝗜𝗢𝗎. Welcome to episode 10, and inshallah ta'ala the final episode, where we will sum up discussing the topic of Jizyah and the rights of non-Muslims within a legitimate Islamic state. Now, in the last episode we discussed the arguments of 𝗧𝗨𝗥𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗜𝗢𝗎, where he spoke about the protection of non-Muslims in the state of war. So he mentioned that within the state of war, after the war has happened, it is not obligatory at all times for the Muslims to say to the mushrikeen that you have to basically convert to Islam or die. Rather, 𝗧𝗨𝗥𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗜𝗢𝗎, he mentioned that the non-Ahlul Kitab have an option of protection by the Muslims. And he also said that when the war finishes or the Muslims have overtaken the non-Muslims, then there are options of captivity, ransoming, or letting them free. So due to this protection that he mentioned in the ahadith, this I believe was proof for him also allowing the jizya to non-Ahlul Kitab, as he mentioned in his books about what an Islamic state would be like, a true Islamic government. And according to his theory, it can be established in the time of the ghaiba, but there are other scholars who forbid that. So this is a discussion between the scholars. But yes, 𝗧𝗨𝗥𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗜𝗢𝗎 showed that protection is allowed for non-Ahlul Kitab, showing that it doesn't just mean that there are two options, whether they convert to Islam or face the sword. And even if we say that the jizya is not accepted for the non-Ahlul Kitab, then they can be exited out the land, and it means that they can be sent to another land. We also mentioned the last argument of 𝗧𝗨𝗥𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗜𝗢𝗎, where he said that how is it from the madhaq, the taste of Islam, flavor of Islam, that if the Muslims would be in a war, defensive war, with, for example, India or a country which is majority non-Muslim, that when the Muslims take over, they would just say to all of them, convert to Islam or die. And then they would have to kill millions and millions of people. He says, how is this from the taste of Islam? Because, as we know, it's not easy for people to become Muslims. Only some of them may become Muslims easily, due to the amount of doubts that we know that exist in this day and age, and the small amount of sources for one to get an answer to some of these doubts. Therefore, they don't come to the truth. So he mentioned these points. But now what we want to come to is the verse of Jizyah. How many times is Jizyah mentioned in the Holy Qur'an? We find that Jizyah is mentioned once in the Holy Qur'an in chapter 9, verse 29. And this verse is often quoted from the enemies of Islam or the people who oppose Islam to say that Islam is a violent religion. And the verse within itself can go through a whole analysis. But let's read the verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, قاتلوا الذين لا يؤمنون بالله ولا باليوم الآخر ولا يحرمون ما حرم الله ورسوله ولا يدينون دين الحق من الذين أوتوا الكتاب حتى يعطوا الجزية عن يد وهم صاغرون. So Allah Azza wa Jal in the Qur'an, what does he say? Fight those who do not believe in Allah and the last day, nor do they prohibit what Allah and His Apostle have prohibited, nor follow the religion of truth out of those who have been given the book, until they pay their jizya in acknowledgement of superiority and are in a state of subjection. So this is one translation of this verse. And of course, with this verse, what they say is that, see, your God in your Qur'an orders you to fight non-Muslims in an absolute sense who do not believe in Allah and the last day. And then at the end of this verse, it speaks about the concept of jizya, and they say that, okay, does this mean that non-Muslims are forced to give jizya in a humiliating way, and a way where you mock them and you ridicule them? And these are questions that they put forth. Now what we say firstly is that this verse is not unconditional. It is not a verse in the sense that in an absolute way that Muslims have to go everywhere and fight non-believers until they become Muslim. This verse had a context, and if one reads Surah At-Tawbah, they see the various verses which were addressed towards the mushrikeen after many, many years of persecution towards the Holy Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the Muslims. So these verses within Surah At-Tawbah and the whole surah itself, the whole surah has a context to it. But what we say about this verse is that this verse should not be read alone. Rather, there are also other peaceful verses that should be read along with this verse. And then these peaceful verses restrict this verse, that this verse does not apply in all circumstances. And one very weak objection that they put forth, which is due to a lack of reading, is that in the Mecca period, all of the verses revealed in Mecca, they were peaceful because the Muslims were small in number, they did not have power. And then in the Medina period, all the violent verses came. And when the Muslims had power, they went on a rampage, forcing people to pay Jizyah, convert to Islam, or killing them. Now this is not the case. And as I said, it's due to a lack of reading. And is very weak. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll discuss this down in the future. Because actually, if you look at the Mecca verses, there are violent and peaceful verses. And if you look at the Medina verses, there are also violent and peaceful verses. So, and not all verses were just revealed in Mecca or Medina. This is another misconception. There were verses that were revealed in Sham, for example. But obviously, the normal terminology they hear is that Meccan and Medinan verses. So this doubt will be answered, but briefly just to mention this verse, which says about fighting the non-believers. It may seem in a general sense, but when we read other verses in the Qur'an, it restricts this, because Muslims are not allowed to just go around and fight other people who do not harm them. And this is clearly mentioned in the Qur'an, where Allah says about not fighting those, that He does not prohibit you to show kindness towards you, those who they are not fighting you because of your religion and not exiting you out of your houses. But let us focus on the part of 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗧𝗜𝗢𝗎, this part of the verse. There are different translations. Pickthall, for example, he says what? He says until they pay the tribute readily, being brought low. Yusuf Ali say until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Mohsin Khan says until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. So is this the purpose? Because as we see in some of the different exegesis from the Shia and the Mukhalifin, there may be concepts or ideas pertaining that jizya has to be in some type of mocking and ridiculing type of way. So inshallah ta'ala, this is what we want to discuss. Now when we looked in the seerah of Ahlul-Bayt alayhim as-salam, we looked in their biography, we saw that their purpose was not to humiliate non-Muslims. This is why we looked at this verse last. Normally you look at a verse first. Why did we look at this verse last? Because we said it's important to look in the seerah of Ahlul-Bayt alayhim as-salam and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. And their biography was one which shows us in history that they advocated justice, fairness and protection towards non-Muslims. And in fact, they would feel saddened when oppression would occur on non-Muslims, and they would stress that oppression on the non-Muslims is like oppression on the Muslims. So is Islam and this verse saying that non-Muslims should be mocked and ridiculed? We go to, for example, Sheikh Baqir Irawani in his book 𝗬𝗓𝗓 on page 226. He gives his interpretation, and then he says هكذا ينبغي أن يفسر الصغار ومن البعيد عن روح الإسلام تفسيره بالاستهزاء والسخرية. So he gives his interpretation of the verses. This is how it should be interpreted, and then he says that it is far from the spirit of Islam to say that the meaning of saghir is mockery and ridiculing. Therefore, how do we understand saghirun? For the part which says عن يد وهم صاغرون, or عن يد, that حتى يعطوا الجزية عن يد, he says that as for intended by the meaning of عن يد, that they pay the jizya by their hand, this is talking about power. When it comes to the state of power being displayed over them due to, let's say, a war by the Muslims, then they must pay this jizya when the Muslims have the authority, because it's their contribution that they have to make. So when the Muslims, they have some control and authority, then they pay the jizya and khalas, they live peacefully. So as we know, we said it was not applied in a non-Islamic government. We are talking theoretically, and we spoke, for example, that say Muhammad Shirazi in his books, he spoke about, yes, the establishment of an Islamic government and how the rules would work towards non-Muslims, which he said were fair and just rules. So this part is also discussed by some scholars, And people will ask a question about the wars. They will say that were the wars and battles of the Prophet or Islam defensive or offensive, that they attacked first. And one example that they like to give is that the caravan of Abu Sufyan, when it was attacked by the Muslims. Now they say that, see, that this is an offensive attack, but they need to understand the overall context, that the disbelievers of Quraysh before that were persecuting the Muslims and obviously killing them as well. And the Quraysh had previously confiscated the property of the Muslim Muhajirs in Medina. So they confiscated and looted their property. Therefore, when this type of raid happened on the caravan of Abu Sufyan, it was justified because the Muslims at that time were claiming back what was taken for them. And as we know, these same mushrikeen, they tortured, banished and violated the Muslim honors, the honor of the Muslims for many years, such as when Ammar bin Yasir, his mother, Sumayyah, was killed, and the Muslims were not enough in power to help her. So there were many things that happened by the mushrikeen, and when this caravan of Abu Sufyan was attacked, it was merely to claim back what was taken from the Muslims. This is one thing that we say for this when some people of enemies of Islam, they say that, oh, look, you can attack offensively. So this was not an injustice when the Muslims in history at this time planned a raid. So when we talk about the Muslims overtaking someone in the context of war or battles, this is due to aggression being put forward against them by the enemies beforehand, in which if the Muslims fought back, they fought back defensively in a war, it could be that they take over this land. So let us get to the main part of the verse, which is وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ, and what this means. Some people say that the tafsir, some scholars say that صَاغِرُونَ does not mean humiliated or feeling low. They say that it means that these non-Muslims, in exchange for their protection and living peacefully, that they submit to the authority of the Islamic system and government. Just like as you do in any country, you have to follow certain laws and rules in order for yourself to live peacefully. So they have their rights, as we mentioned in the previous episodes, and they can practice their religion. So Saghirun, one of the tafsirs for this verse is in this context, that what Wahum Saghirun means when they are submitted to the state authority. And I also believe even some non-Shi'is had a similar interpretation. There was one person, I believe Dr. Jamal Badawi, he had a debate with some Christian pastor who was an Iranian, and he mentioned this similar tafsir. And some of the Shia Quranic exegetes, one of them mentions, for example, this implies that the payment of this tax is a sign of their submission to Islam and the Holy Qur'an. What does it mean, submission to Islam and Holy Qur'an? That means they have to be Muslim? No. In other words, it implies their readiness to peacefully live as a religious minority among the ruling majority. So this is one of the tafsirs that some scholars give for this verse, and submitting in a way that is not being ridiculed or mocking. As Baqir Irwani mentioned, that this is against the overall spirit of Islam, which is to what? Promote ethics, good behavior and good manners towards the whole of humanity. So to mock them like that would not be consistent with the general Islamic teachings. The tafsir too is what? Some have said that no, this ayah does not include all of Ahlul Kitab. It includes those who want to bring fasad, they want to bring corruption towards the society and openly do things such as drinking and alcohol, etc. So these are the ones, they must feel subdued to the laws of not doing this. This is one exegesis that some people give. And then the third exegesis, which actually seems to match with one of the hadiths that we have relating to this verse, we will go into this. The exegesis 3 is what? That this ayah, we can say that this ayah means وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ, that they feel belittled or subdued. But the verse does not apply to all of the people of the book, the Ahlul-Kitab. What do I mean by this? For example, you have a peaceful Christian, a peaceful Jew, Zoroastrian who lives with you in the majority Muslim country, which, let's say, for example, has a legitimate Islamic government. They are not fighting you, and they are just the residents from that place. Because as we know, in Iran and Iraq, we have for many hundreds of years Christians living there, or even thousands of years, not Ahlul Kitab people. So some of the exegetes say what? That these people would pay the jizya normally as their contribution, not feeling saghirun in the sense of feeling subdued or belittled. They just pay jizya normally. But then those who were fighting in a war, so a war broke out between the Muslims and the non-Muslims. They were fighting and trying to kill the Muslims. And then after that, the Muslims, out of having compassion towards them and mercy, didn't kill them. But they were trying to kill the Muslims in a state of war. After that, these people, they would come under of saghirun. Why? Because they tried to kill the Muslims unjustly. They are having their own life saved by not being killed. And they have to pay the jizya whilst feeling what? It as subdued and with willing submission. So they were not the normal Ahlul Kitab, they were those who were trying to fight. And feeling subdued means they have to accept it. They have to pay this, and they have no choice to do that. And for fighting against the Muslims in an unjust manner, they have to feel that this is a type of punishment for them. So not for all of the Ahlul Kitab who are peaceful, for those who were aggressing. Because we find a narration, I believe an authentic narration, from Zurara, from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, in the hadith where Imam alayhi salam says what? وَكَيْفَ يَكُونُ صَاغِرًا وهو لا يكترث لما يؤخذ منه حتى يجد ذلا لما أخذ منه فيعلم لذلك فيسلم. So what does the Imam say? He says about the verse, and he said how, and this is the only hadith that I found pertaining to this verse, which is mentioned, for example, in al-Burhan and Tafsir Safi, these are 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗍𝗍 tafsir exegesis. The Imam says, and how would it happen to be belittled? How would he happen to be belittled if he does not care to what is taken from him due to its low, in brackets, due to its low rate, until he finds humiliation to what is taken from him. So he would be hurt by that and become a Muslim. So this is an al-Kafi. So what is the Imam saying here regarding the jizya? We mentioned what? We said that feeling subdued or feeling that they have to accept it lowly wouldn't apply to all of the Ahlul Kitab, the peaceful ones. This would apply to those who are in a state of war. And the Imam in this hadith, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, is saying what? He's saying that how would this person feel low if, for example, out of a war, he tried to kill the Muslims. The Muslims are still giving him his life due to this. They're showing him mercy, giving him his life. And then there is no punishment for him due to doing this in war. So the Imams, let's say, for example, the person's jizya would be like a very low rate, £1, or a very, very small amount of money. He wouldn't see that as a punishment. So what the Imam alayhi salam is possibly trying to say here to us is that, look, the rate of the jizya for that person would have to be a rate in which it is like a penalty or fine for them. Because as we know, when some people, they commit a crime, they have a fine that is allocated to them. They have a fine. And due to this fine, they feel that, oh, okay, I've done something wrong. But the fine has to be an amount which would affect them, not a fine which is very, very small. That someone goes to court and they say, you have a £5 fine and he's done a big crime. There would be no type of feeling subdued or punishment there for the crime that he's done. Therefore, for this verse, when we look at the hadith and we link it with this verse, we find that this most likely could be the correct exegesis. That is what? Jizya when it says in the Qur'an about 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗧𝗜𝗢𝗎 عَنْ يَدٍ وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ, this does not apply to all of the Ahlul Kitab in the sense that they must feel subdued. Rather, it is only for those who fought against the Muslims in an unjust manner and then they were not killed after that, but they have to pay this jizya and an amount of jizya which would be like a fine for them, like a penalty for them, which would affect them. And if any of them said the shahada after that, they would be Muslim. So therefore, Islam does not say that non-Muslims should pay the jizya in a way which they are mocked and ridiculed, nor does Islam, according to the biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Ahlul-Bayt alayhim salam, say that one should humiliate and oppress non-Muslims. Rather, they should be given their rights. So, this was the example, dear brothers and sisters, and how we explained this verse according to some of the Quranic exegetes. Because as I found, there was nothing in English discussing the surrounding issues of this verse of jizya, although this concept does not apply today. And inshallah ta'ala, this was an enlightful series for everyone, and inshallah ta'ala, it provokes further research. So we gave our conclusion that Ahlul-Bayt alayhim salam and the Holy Qur'an does not discriminate or persecute non-Muslims, although it may, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Qur'an may say that their beliefs are wrong, but rather we see the non-Muslims are treated in a just and fair way. And when Allah says about giving the jizya whilst feeling subdued, we've mentioned the first tafsir, which is only for a section of the people of the book who were fighting against the non-Muslims in an unjust manner, and therefore they have to feel subdued in the sense that if they are keeping their lives, they pay a type of fine. And this is mentioned in the hadith by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم ولعن أعداءهم. بالله بمحمد بن علي بفاطمة بالحسن بالحسين بالأئمة الأطهار.